The biting wind howled outside the isolated cabin, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers tapping for entry. Inside, Elias huddled by the crackling fire, the only source of warmth and light in the vast, snow-covered wilderness. He had sought refuge here, in this remote corner of the world, hoping to find solace and quiet after a personal tragedy that had left him feeling adrift. But the solitude, he was beginning to realize, had a sinister edge. It started with the whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible sounds that he initially dismissed as the wind playing tricks on his ears. They seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabin, a low, murmuring chorus just beyond the threshold of hearing. He would strain to decipher them, but they always remained just out of reach, a tantalizing whisper on the edge of comprehension. As the days turned into nights, the whispers grew more insistent. They began to coalesce into discernible words, though their meaning remained elusive. He would hear his name, spoken in a hushed, urgent tone, followed by fragments of sentences that seemed to fade away before he could grasp their entirety. "Elias, be careful," one whisper might say, only to be swallowed by the wind. "They're watching." Another would murmur, sending a shiver of unease down his spine. The isolation began to weigh heavily on Elias's mind. The endless expanse of white outside the windows seemed to mirror the emptiness within him. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, a growing paranoia taking root in his thoughts. Was he truly alone here, or was something else sharing this desolate space with him? Then came the shadows. Fleeting movements in the periphery of his vision, dark shapes that seemed to flicker and dance just beyond the reach of the firelight. He would whirl around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there would be nothing there. Just the familiar shapes of the cabin's rustic furniture cast in the flickering glow of the flames. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant, unnerving presence that clung to him like the icy air outside. One particularly long and storm-ridden night, the whispers intensified. They seemed to surround him, coming from all directions at once, a cacophony of hushed voices that swirled around his head, their words now chillingly clear. "Leave," they urged. "You're not safe here. They're coming for you." Elias clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the voices, but they seemed to penetrate his very skull, echoing in the hollow chambers of his mind. He felt a growing sense of panic, a desperate urge to flee this place, but the blizzard raged outside, trapping him within the cabin's increasingly oppressive walls. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. A gust of icy wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing several of the flickering candles, plunging the room into deeper shadows. Elias gasped, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It simply stood there, silently watching him. Terror seized Elias. He scrambled back, knocking over a chair in his haste, his eyes fixed on the figure in the doorway. He tried to speak, to scream, but his voice seemed to have deserted him. The figure remained motionless, its silence more terrifying than any scream. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to raise a hand. Its fingers were long and skeletal, their tips blackened as if by frostbite. As it reached towards him, Elias squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the touch never came. After what felt like an eternity, he cautiously opened his eyes. The figure was gone. The wind had died down. The cabin was silent once more, save for the crackling of the fire. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the light and his overwrought imagination? He wanted to believe that, desperately, but a lingering sense of dread remained, a cold knot of fear in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something was still watching him from the shadows. As dawn finally broke, casting a pale, weak light through the cabin windows, Elias knew he had to leave. He couldn't spend another night in this place, haunted by whispers and spectral figures. He packed his meager belongings, his hands trembling, and ventured out into the snow. The blizzard had subsided, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white. As Elias trudged through the deep snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He would occasionally glance back, but there was nothing there. Just his own footprints in the snow, stretching back towards the silent, isolated cabin. He walked for hours, his legs growing weary, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as he began to think he was finally out of the woods, he heard it again. The whispers, they were faint at first, carried on the wind, but they grew louder as he continued to walk. "You can't escape us, Elias," they seemed to say. "This place never lets go. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest, a desperate surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could see a road in the distance, a sign of civilization, a promise of escape. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. Just as he reached the edge of the forest, he tripped over something buried beneath the snow. He fell forward, landing heavily on his hands and knees. Gasping for breath, he looked back to see what had tripped him. Lying half buried in the snow was a wooden sign. It was old and weathered, its paint peeling, but the inscription was still legible. It read, "Welcome to Havenwood Cabin, permanent residents only." War, the tragedy that had driven Elias to seek the desolate solitude of Havenwood Cabin, was a raw wound, still festering beneath a fragile scab of forced composure. It had been the loss of his daughter, a vibrant young soul snatched away by a sudden illness. The city, with its constant reminders of life and laughter, had become unbearable. He had hoped the stark silence of the wilderness would offer a kind of anesthetic for his grief, a place where he could simply be without the constant ache in his chest. He hadn't anticipated that the silence would bring its own torment, a chorus of whispers that preyed on his vulnerability. The cabin itself was a study in rustic decay. Built from rough, hewn logs, it groaned and creaked with every gust of wind, as if the very wood was sighing with age and sorrow. The single room was sparsely furnished with a rickety wooden table, 2 worn chairs, and a narrow cot covered with a threadbare quilt. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney a dark gash against the snowy landscape. The windows, small and grimy, offered a limited view of the surrounding forest, their glass often obscured by swirling snow or clinging frost. It was a place that felt both temporary and eternal, a liminal space between the world of the living and something else entirely. Elias stared at the sign, his blood running cold. He looked back at the forest he had just emerged from. In the distance, through the trees, he could see the faint outline of the cabin, and standing in front of it in the clear morning light was the tall, gaunt figure he had seen in the doorway. It was no longer obscured by shadows. Its features were now clearly visible. It was him. He was looking at himself, a gaunt, hollow-eyed version of himself, standing motionless in front of the cabin. And as he watched, the figure slowly raised a hand and beckoned him back into the woods. The whispers surrounded Elias, no longer faint, but a deafening chorus in his mind. "Welcome home, Elias," they hissed. "You're one of us now." He didn't run. He couldn't. A chilling realization washed over him. He hadn't been seeking refuge in the cabin. He had been returning.